Good morning, everyone. I am very happy to welcome you here. I'm Carol Swallow, the chair of the Department of Surgery at the University of Toronto. And on behalf of myself and Dr. Bev Orser, who's the chair of the Department of Anesthesiology and Pain Medicine, it's our pleasure to co-sponsor this Kergin University Rounds. I welcome all of you who are here in person, and thank you to our OR nurses and house staff at Sinai for coming out. And also welcome everyone who is online and joining us virtually. This is a bit of an innovation, I guess you could say, to have a combined departmental Kergin Rounds. This is normally a lecture given by a surgeon. But we've taken advantage of this opportunity to invite a guest from afar, who's an anaesthetist in Melbourne, Forbes McGain, who's quite well known in this area of planetary health, and also foreshadowing of the Palmer Lecture, March 3rd, we have invited Husein Moloo from Ottawa, who's the chair of planetary health there, to basically lead a discussion after Dr. McGain's talk. So welcome, Husein. It's great to have you here. It's our honor. And I'd like to start the official proceedings by acknowledging that the land upon which the University of Toronto operates was for thousands of years the traditional homelands of many Indigenous people, including the Anishinaabe, the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. I'd also like to acknowledge that we are privileged to work and gather on this land together with the many Indigenous peoples who still make it their home, people across Turtle Island. And I would like to vow that we will strive to work with them to uphold the 94 calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. So I've given you a little foretaste of what these rounds are going to be like. We also have people to introduce each of our speakers. And the first is going to be Nam Lay, who's going to introduce Forbes McGain. Nam?
Thank you, Dr. Swallow. So good morning, everybody. And similar to what Dr. Swallow said, thank you very much for the opportunity to bring us all together, both surgeons and anesthetists, to talk about and discuss an important topic. And some of you may recognize me. I was recently at Mount Sinai as an anesthesiologist and now in North York General Hospital. And I have had the great opportunity to help organize these rounds along with my colleague, Dr. Sarah Ward, who will introduce Dr. Moloo later. So I will introduce Dr. McGain. He is joining us virtually from a pre-recorded lecture. And Dr. McGain is an anaesthetist and an intensive care physician at Western Health in Melbourne, Australia, and an associate professor at the School of Public Health and at the University of Sydney in critical care at the University of Melbourne. He enjoys being involved in research, teaching, and education at the hospital, university, and beyond. He remains passionate about making seemingly small environmental sustainability changes to how we practice medicine that become magnified through every nation's hospitals. His love of nature affects everything he does at work, home, and, well, everywhere. So please welcome Dr. McGain.
Hello, my name is Forbes McGain. I'm an anaesthetist and intensive care physician at Western Health in Melbourne, Australia, Associate Dean in the Medicine, Dentistry and Health Sciences faculty at the University of Melbourne, and Associate Professor at Public Health, University of Sydney. I'd like to introduce this topic of being part of something big, being environmentally sustainable. And I'd very much like to thank the University of Toronto for allowing me to give this speech, the Kergin lecture, based on, I noticed, I was looking up, he was a very well-known thoracic surgeon in Canada. My disclosures are that I have grants with a number of colleges in intensive care and anaesthesia and the National Health and Medical Research Council, a member of Doctors for the Environment, and I'd like to acknowledge quite a number of people, but in particular Scott McAllister, who's a life cycle expert, a number of engineers, nurses, doctors, the colleges I've just mentioned. Wiser healthcare is very important, as well as the broader sustainable healthcare community, which I know certainly extends into Canada now, for the good work of Andrew McNeil, surgeon in British Columbia. So we all know a bit about climate change, and we know that we're in trouble from it. And this lecture is not really going to spend too much time on that in the next 20 minutes or so. What I would say is, here's the carbon emissions. This is a Lancet article from a few years ago now, showing the cumulative emissions, which you can see worldwide is very much focused on the lens of North America and Europe. China's still prominent there, but the effects of climate change disproportionately will affect particularly the global South, Africa, and South and East Asia. And so very prominent in their effects will be mal-distributed. Beyond those ethical concerns, this is a photo of me with a Royal this is a photo of the Royal Flying Doctor Service I took back in 2006 in Alice Springs in Central Australia, as you can see with the red dirt. I became interested in how sustainable healthcare was, thinking about all the good work that we were doing there for retrieval medicine, but how incredibly intensive it was, not just from an energy perspective and oil and airplane fuel, etc., but also the stuff that we use on a day-to-day basis in the operating theatre and beyond. So we should remind ourselves that we're dealing with a number of different carbon emissions here. When we talk about scopes 1, 2, and 3, you can see on the left-hand side in green here, not very green though, fossil fuels. This is a UK brochure, so you can see national service facilities or hospitals, anaesthetics coming in there, and fleet and leased vehicles coming in. So scope 1 is sort of like the direct things we often think about, as well as scope 2, which is electricity in the lighter blue. But we should remind ourselves the darker blue is all the stuff that we use in healthcare. And that's a very important part of healthcare in particular, as opposed to some other economic sectors of our nations. So scope 3 is really, really important. We'll see that again come through and it also gives us a lot of scope and agency to make change for scope 3. This is where the clinicians come in. Not so much in here. This is more with the engineers working in the hospitals, us working with them, with anaesthetics as well. But the darker blue being scope 3. So remember, scope 3 is the big one, and that's why it actually appears bigger here, because it's a greater proportion of the pie of carbon that we emit in healthcare. So we did a study similar to quite a number of other studies that have now been done in various nations, including the United States, Canada, and China. And you can see carbon footprint. In Australia, we looked at, with Aranima Malik and Manfred Lenz and Scott myself, the carbon footprint associated with our healthcare, and it's about 7%. So that's not insignificant. We often hear in Australia that, around 15% of our total carbon emissions for the nation are from agriculture. Well, about half of that is from healthcare. Interestingly enough, from work from Matt Eckelman, Jody Sherman, and Andrew McNeil, that Canada is about 5% of the total emissions of Canada come from healthcare, and that's fairly similar to the worldwide percentage. So in other words, if healthcare was a nation, it would be above Japan and Russia for its actual emissions, so to be ranked in there at about number 5 or 6, and it'd be a really big one. So it's important to keep in mind that healthcare is important, and that's been quantified fairly well in quite a number of nations now. What happens to that? This is now back to the Australian data. This is our 7%. And what it's showing you here is of that 7% now of healthcare carbon emissions, where's that coming from? We broke it down. You can break it down to whatever means you wish. But what was interesting was looking at the blue, which is our public health system, which I know in Canada is really the only part of the healthcare system. Private is still relatively important, about 10%. Pharmaceuticals are interesting, aren't they? They come in at almost 20% in the green there. That's pharmaceuticals separate out from whether it's in the hospital or otherwise, they're just taking it separately. So pharmaceuticals are a really big industry and big high carbon going on from there. What's interesting also is to think that general practice in the red there is a very small part, but that little red zone is really important in reducing the amount of all of the other carbon that we produce. So the GP, the general practitioner, community medicine person, they do a great job in reducing the carbon of everything else by preventing, harm, by stopping smoking, diabetes, obesity, preventive health with vaccines. All the rest of it are really important there. So keep in mind where the carbon emissions are coming from, and not unexpectedly, they're coming from hospitals and pharmaceuticals. Devices and things like that are in there a bit separately. They're not so much in the aids and appliances there. So devices are also very important. What I would say is reinforcing work. This is what, based on some of our information that we looked at recently with Alex Barrett from Sydney Uni, that if we were once again looking at the carbon emissions here that we were showing you before, what we could say is, here's the blue, this is all the clinical work, this is the actual buildings and electricity and gas. But if you just focus on clinical care, which is at least 2/3 of the story, more like 80% in some countries, then that's important also because sure, we can be doing lots of effective care, and that's great what we're doing as anaesthetists and surgeons and others, but we should never forget that unfortunately in the amber and also in the red, low value and harmful care. And so these are just really not only just socially problematic, economically woeful, but also environmentally disturbing as well. So there's enormous scope there to try to reduce what's going on and choose wisely, both from a social and an environmental perspective. Of course, here we are. We will focus on now in the operating room. It's an extravaganza. There are lots of equipment that's used, lots of it single use. Essentially, if you look at this photo here of an operation, this was not in my hospital, but it could easily be in any other hospital. You can see lots of the only reusable equipment really is the metalware. Everything else, the gowns, the gloves, the single-use equipment there, all the drapes, all the drapes over here as well are all single-use except for the metalware. Now, this might seem like last century to many, but this is Western Health in Melbourne. You'll notice there's reusable gowns and reusable drapes. There'll be reusable plasticware. So a lot of this plasticware elsewhere in other hospitals in Melbourne is all chucked away. Here's some chuck away here, but most things are reusable. Not so much some of the ports and laparoscopic, they can be throwaway as well, but important to keep in mind that it doesn't have to be this way, and infection rates and surgical care can be just as good with reusable as opposed to disposable equipment. So keep that in mind. I would also say that we shouldn't forget that our effects as a doctor in that work matters more than home. That's really important as well. What I mean by that is that there's a large carbon burden, much larger carbon burden, which will happen when we go to work than when we are at home. Here's a look now at some anaesthetic gases. You can see desflurane is a bit of a problem here, as the anaesthetists already know here. I won't dwell on this because this is well known, but it is to say that just providing 1 hour of desflurane is equivalent to keeping a patient anaesthetised for several days with sevoflurane in terms of a carbon footprint. And that 1 hour of desflurane is like burning 30 litres of petrol. So, that's so it's in the order of 6 or 7 gallons of petrol will be gasoline will be burnt as a similar carbon emissions to desflurane. So you can easily drive your car several hundred kilometres for the use of it. Fortunately, I know in Canada and in many other parts of the world there's reduced use. What was also exciting is that this came out literally only a couple of days ago. In the UK, the Greener Healthcare is getting rid of desflurane throughout their entire nation of England, and Scotland and Wales moving in the same direction as well. So that's really exciting to see what can be done there. Similarly, we should focus on nitrous oxide. That's a bit of a problem, used a lot, particularly in maternity, much more so than in theatres these days. What we showed here from this small study was that the actual the carbon emissions associated with giving birth to a child over a 4-hour labour is about 250 kilograms of CO2. Now, what does that mean? Well, that's like burning 100 litres of petrol. So it's once again a large amount of energy driving your car, an average car, probably in the order of 1,000 kilometres, and all the other forms of anaesthesia that you can provide, which are similar, if not better, in their analgesic effects for maternity and birth, for the birth, are much, much lower, orders of magnitude less. So it's something that we do need to work on, because in these days we're seeing from our work and others that most nitrous now is being used in maternity rather than the operating room. Also, really importantly, work that we've done, as well as Olivia Chikera, great work in Scotland, good work happening in Wales and otherwhere with Amarantha and others, looking at reducing the amount of leaks that are happening with nitrous oxide. It's extraordinary the amount of leaks. We found 70% of the actual nitrous was being lost before it even got to the patient in our operating theatres here in Melbourne, and similar effects we're seeing elsewhere, has been found in Scotland, etc. So a lot to do there. We'll focus on the waste hierarchy now. I know we know this fairly well: avoid, reduce, reuse, recycle, and then we'll get on to life cycles and what we can all be doing to try and reduce our carbon emissions and reduce our water use, for example. So here's a study I was involved in quite a few years ago now, getting on to a decade. We looked at the interval changes between just looking at breathing circuits now. We'll get onto the other equipment in a moment. We were changing these circuits daily. Now, I know in the United States, they're still changing the circuits with each and every patient, and that still occurs. That is slowly changing, drifting away from that, because each patient has an individual filter that they will use. So it's single-use filter, but you don't have to have a single-use circuit. We just clean the circuits. We do the microbiological study and found that whether it's a 1, 2 or 7 day changing period, there was no difference in the microbiological load. Similar study was done by others in Germany following that up. They actually did some work with viruses as well. So all pointing to the fact that you don't increase the burden and increase rates of ventilator-associated pneumonia, etc., when you're changing the circuits less frequently. That's got massive and really important financial and environmental effects, and not just carbon, but also water for washing. So no difference in microbiological infection rates, and as a result of that, it's quite exciting to be involved in a process in research that actually leads to real change. So now I walk into operating theatre and there's a little sign saying circuits changed, on Monday of last week, time to change them. So you change them 1 week later, not every day. Life cycle assessment is all about a cradle to grave. So you go from extracting something out of the ground, manufacturing it, distributing it, and then using it or throwing it away, and perhaps recycling it or reusing it, re-sterilising it, for example. So this process has been, this sort of scientific method has been around for quite a while, and there are people who are experts in this area, relatively small in number of people doing this, but that is increasing with time. What we looked at a few years ago now was comparing reusable and disposable laryngoscope blades and face masks and circuits, and we also looked at laryngeal masks. What we were quite interested in was a comparison between 2 hospitals in Melbourne comparing single-use to reusable. Now, what you've got to do when you do these life cycles is quite tedious and it's quite a process, but that's science. You have to look at the holding trays for the washer in action, sterilizer loads that are going on there, and you've really got to find out what's occurring for the whole process there, and that includes the energy and water use of the washer and the steam sterilizer. This is the back of the steam sterilizer there. You can see that there's a wrapped up in silver there is the back of the sterilizer. You put your load at the front. We hooked up a Wi-Fi, measured the water energy use for almost a year, over 1,000 loads, and we're able to do some good calculations of, if you load a sterilizer this way, what's the energy consumption, etc. Now, for this study, if we just focus here on the red, this is our reusable equipment. It's the face masks and the circuits and the laryngoscope blades and handles and things. And here's the carbon emissions. The numbers don't matter so much, but if we just focus on this is reusable here and this is disposable here, there really isn't much difference. In fact, the reusable is slightly higher in carbon emissions. It's more to the point that this is very different as a carbon emissions to, say, Europe or even the USA. And I suspect Toronto would be down down here because you use mainly nuclear. Might be different in some other parts of Canada, but I know British Columbia would be well down here as well because you're based on they're based on hydroelectric. So your energy source is really, really crucial for how you, what the carbon footprint is of reusable equipment. Not quite, I mean, it's still important for single use, and we'll talk about why it isn't quite the same, but it is really important to know that. So what we're excited about here in Victoria is that we will soon be powered by wind and solar to the tune of 100% electricity in the next few years. So that's underway. There's a lot of building going on of wind farms and solar in the northern parts of our state, which is still in the south of Australia, but there's still plenty of sun. And it's really that story that renewables make reusables better. In other words, having renewable electricity makes reusable equipment better. It is one of my take-home messages to you there in Toronto, is to say that your energy source is vital and reusables are better from a carbon footprint point of view if the source of your electricity is renewables. What I want to say is that here's, just imagine what we call a process diagram for manufacturing plastics. You can see that, imagine if you, being our own devil's advocate, imagine if we said, oh, surely if we just use renewable electricity for our single-use equipment, then surely that will just overcome the problem. Sadly, the feedstock is still the main issue for plastics of petrochemical base. Here's an example. You can see 3/4 of the carbon footprint is coming through from there, from the feedstock, which is a propylene, and then you form a poly version of it. And so it doesn't matter if it's renewable electricity that you're using, because the electricity part of the story is only contributing about 1/4 of the total, or maybe 20%. So in other words, even if that is completely renewable electricity, it's only going to reduce your carbon footprint by about 1/5. It doesn't have the same effect because the feedstock hasn't changed. So you have to go move over to bioplastics or something completely different if you're going to try and reduce the carbon footprint of your single-use plastics. Moving on, so what I would say is that as a result of that study with reusable equipment, we're quite exciting. I mean, the real change again was that we moved to reusable equipment, and the single use sort of disappeared from most anaesthetic equipment we've got at Western Health, and face masks and laryngoscope blades and handles and circuits, and it's pretty exciting to see that. What was, even though it didn't change very much the carbon footprint, as you saw, that will happen fairly soon in the next year or two. But importantly, it also saved money, and that includes the cost of washing it and sterilising in the background. So we took into account time and motion studies of the staff in the back of house, and that saves about $5,000, or I suppose it's around, what is it, 4,200, something like that, Canadian dollars per operating theatre per year. Not a large amount, but it adds up. When you've got 20 theatres, that's $100,000 a year per annum. So it starts to add up. I won't dwell on this one too much, but this is another study we recently came out in anesthesiology. This was comparing different types of anaesthesia, general and combined and regional, for total knee replacements. And that was an exciting study we got involved with. We looked at just 10 patients in each group. What I will show you the results here in a nutshell, because I don't want the surgeons to go to sleep. I want to make sure that they're still engaged. This is not all just about anaesthetics. And what I would show is that sevoflurane we were using quite a lot of. We don't use any desflurane really anymore. It's all gone from our hospital. We use a little bit of nitrous, but not very much. Sevoflurane was the main contributor to the carbon footprint for those 10 patients having general anaesthesia for a knee replacement. You see yellows there, quite a significant part. The other important parts are single-use plastics and the electricity for warming the patient. Interesting thing to think about it is, just warming the patient is a significant part of the story. The total amount here is not a large amount, 15 kilograms. That's in the order of about 7 litres of petrol, an easier way to sort of think of things. Spinal anaesthetic surprisingly had a higher carbon footprint than the general anaesthetic. That seems strange, but it's not just about a needle that goes into someone's back for a knee replacement. It's also this stuff here. This is the electricity for cleaning. We use mainly reusable equipment, and the problem once again is because at the moment that's modelled on coal, just as it would be in China, for example. So your electricity source has a high carbon footprint. Very different if you're, say, in British Columbia or even in Toronto. I suspect that that red, the darker red would be quite a small slither. And so with the lighter red would be all a smaller slither as well, because the electricity for the warmer for the patient would be based on renewable or at least nuclear energy. What's interesting here is the blue, the oxygen, was a considerable contributor to that. That was mainly because people ran much higher oxygen rates, so 6 to 10 litres per minute, as opposed to 1 or 2 litres for the general anaesthesia. And of course, if you do a combined anaesthetic, often it's a bit worse overall because you've still got a lot of the things putting together, the spinal equipment. What's interesting is another number of things and stories came from this. Is like, well, why do we actually use a gown, for example, which needs washing, and electricity, which is based on coal, to sterilise that when you're putting in a spinal anaesthetic? Because I know, for example, I've talked to a number of anesthesiologists in Canada and US and elsewhere in Europe, that they don't use gowns, and their infection rates, to all intents and purposes, are no different, because really it's a no-touch technique. And so if you think, well, that doesn't matter if it's just one gown for one doctor doing one anaesthetic, that really adds up when you think of all the spinal anaesthetics that are going on there, and so it starts to become quite important. What I would say, we've looked through that there, I'm going to move straight on, is that the anaesthetic approaches were similar, had similar carbon footprints. The differences weren't really that important. We already knew that desflurane and nitrates were a problem. Using TIVA reduces the general anaesthetic carbon emissions because it's a very small part of the story there. And a few of the patients had TIVA, and so they were taken into account. And that spinal anaesthesia isn't really low carbon in Victoria, China, but it is in Europe and probably Canada to a large extent. Choosing wisely important. What I mean by that is reducing single-use plastic. There was more variation in the use of plastics between anaesthetists for each group than there were in the total differences between each group. So in other words, saying individual choices by anaesthetists were actually quite important for the range of plastics used and thus the range of carbon. Reducing the oxygen flows is obviously just something you can do very easily, and advocating for energy efficiency and renewable electricity is important. Briefly, I would say there's a few other things coming out. It's quite exciting times. There's carbon footprints coming out left, right and centre. We did one on carbon footprint of pathology testing. This was looking at very common tests you'd see every day. You'd recognise those, slightly different terminology perhaps. But they've got, if this was 1,000 tests, so one test of an FBE, full blood examination, would be only driving a car 3/4 of a kilometre, which isn't really that important, but it actually adds up when you think of the sheer numbers of these tests being done every day. What's important to remember here is that most of the carbon footprint for this is actually stemming from the plastic of the tubing. It's not so much running the machines that spin and centrifuge and things. They don't actually use that much energy. And so it's actually just, it's not really about reusing and recycling. You can't really do that when you've got things that have got blood in them, but it's about reducing the number of unnecessary tests and choosing wisely. So maybe in the future, that will be a good example of where an intervention and a reduction in the use of unnecessary tests have occurred because of environmental factors, because often doctors don't really know about the costs of things, or they don't really care as much because they're not getting money. But perhaps if it's an environmental stimulation, then maybe there's an opportunity there for changing. This is another quite recent study we've done of radiology. So we've now got pathology and radiology in common tests. You can see there's been good work by Janet Toomey and others in the past here from Kansas, and that we followed up with some tests. Some studies we've done here of MRIs and CTs. X-rays and ultrasounds really just aren't that important in terms of, even though sheer numbers are large, their footprint is quite small. And yes, it will matter in the greater number, but really what you want to be doing is reducing the number of MRIs and CTs that are unnecessary, which sadly we know there are, for example, with low back pain for MRIs or CTs. This story here, 18 kilograms of an MRI, about half of that for a CT, this would be like, burning in the order of about 8 litres of petrol, and about half of that for CT scans. So it does add up. I want to just quickly mention that COVID-19, which we've all gone through, it really has become the land of single use, and there's been some good work. For example, Chantal Rizan, R-I-Z-A-N, has done some good work on PPE waste in the UK and trying to reduce it. We had a look at that as well. One of the things we did was emulate a general practitioner Dr. Kirby White in one of the country hospitals in Victoria, Southern Australia. These are reusable gowns. They just couldn't get enough gowns. They could not get enough gowns to do general practice when COVID hit, because all the single-use gowns, which are essentially coming from China, the hospitals snapped them up. And so this is what we're going to do, because if we miss out, not only is it general practice and it's a business, but it's also actually reducing the burden on hospitals. We want to keep seeing patients. So they got local seamstresses to actually make reusable gowns. And that's really exciting, because now she's gone through at least 10 to 15,000 of these gowns that are just being washed rather than chucked away. And saved quite a lot of money, saved from a carbon footprint point of view, and also saved from a water footprint point of view. We can talk about that in just a moment. Sam Bates is the research nurse I work with, doing some good work together. And what was exciting is, so at Western Health alone, and we went through more than 1 million disposable gowns last year during COVID, about a similar number the year before, and not far off. So we've now got to reusable gowns. What was exciting about that is that this is our intensive care. We've actually saved money on that as well. I've been quite exciting to get a contract that saves money, about $1 a pop. So that's great. We've got reusable gowns going in the back. I didn't want to show the patient, but you can see they're putting a central line in the background. That's also a reusable sterile gown. This is just a reusable barrier gown. So, it's exciting. Gowns, I'm going to mention for surgeons as well. What if I wear a disposable gown? Well, how does that compare to driving a car? Look, approximately, and it depends a little bit on your energy source, but every time you wear a disposable gown as a surgeon that's been sterilised, you will travel an extra 10, 20 kilometres compared to your reusable gown. So in addition, in your standard car, 10 kilometres a litre, you've driven an extra 20 kilometres every time you put on a single gown, every time. And so you can start to see it adds up. That's the thing about healthcare, it adds up pretty fast, because there's so much of this generalizability. It's all going on in every hospital in the country and beyond. So go reusable and stop driving at work. And I remember, I point your attention to VOP Solar, Eric and Michael Overcash, good work they've done on saving, reducing carbon emissions from comparing reusable versus disposable gowns. There's been a number of studies there. Mentioned PVC recycling. I know Dr. Saeed Abbas there in Toronto is doing good work on instituting PVC recycling. You can see the common equipment here, oxygen tubing, etc. We got this going back in 2009, and that's exciting. We've got more than 200 hospitals in Australia and New Zealand turning it into pipe. So there's your oxygen tubing and IV fluid bags. Baxter has been great with this. Very exciting to see something useful and actually that's worth money. So I always get excited about recycling when there's a valuable product that is worth money at the end of the show. So the pathways, I think the individual agency of surgeons and anesthesiologists is really important about, not using as much oxygen or changing different types of gases. Choosing wisely is really important there about radiology and pathology and surgery. Reducing the amount of disposable equipment when it's safely possible. It's not saying getting rid of it all, but by all means, by all means getting rid of all of it. It's really trying to say that focus on things that don't need to be disposable. Sterilizer cycle numbers is really important to try and use a sterilizer really appropriately for your operations. So cutting back on unnecessary equipment that would increase the number of loads as a surgeon. For the anaesthetist, we already mentioned low flow anesthesia, oxygen, total intravenous anesthesia, and regional is the way to go where possible. And the concept of reusing equipment, a really big story and requires a lot of conversation and a lot of thinking there, as well as recycling. The broader pathways, I think, is about collaboration all the way through here. Being part of something bigger, as the title of this talk, this Kergin lecture gives. Engaging in infection prevention is going to be incredibly important. It's a hard, long road there, because there is a natural tension between protecting the patient and the environment. Hospital engineers have done a lot of work there in the background, and that's been great. That takes time and effort, but it's worth it. And then the senior medical staff, I mentioned CAPE, the Canadian group, really important. And I think we're seeing changes coming to medtech as well, incorporating carbon into healthcare, adding carbon emissions to health technology assessments. In other words, every time a new product comes in, well, hang on, have we thought about the environmental footprint of using this? And I think that it's quite exciting. I was just looking right now why Canada needs a net zero health system. This is the Canadian Medical Association. There's a lot happening there. And so look to the future, look to your colleagues, look to the engineers, and work together to make this an exciting transition to low carbon super healthcare. Thanks very much for your time. I hope you enjoy the rest of your the lecture and the debate or questions and answers that will come by Dr. Husein Moloo. Thanks.
All right, so that was a good warm-up. And now to introduce our in-person visiting speaker, it's my pleasure to introduce intern Sarah Ward, who's an orthopedic surgeon at St. Michael's Hospital and who is our departmental lead for Planetary Health for the Department of Surgery. Sarah.
Thanks very much. So that was a great lecture by Dr. McGain. It's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Husein Moloo. So he's an accomplished colorectal surgeon and associate professor of surgery at the University of Ottawa. And in his previous role as the departmental vice chair of quality and safety in Ottawa, he noticed a lot of intersections with planetary health, and that became more of a focus. So this led to his appointment as the director of planetary health for the Faculty of Medicine at the University of Ottawa. And now he's actually also the physician planetary health lead for the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons of Canada. So it's a great pleasure to welcome Dr. Moloo.
All right, well, thank you very much. You just heard from, it's pretty cool, like Forbes McGain, like an international superstar in planetary health. So it was really great for me to hear a lecture by him, and now it's kind of cool. I get to moderate this session without him being present, so I guess I can reflect on whatever I want about his talk. I would say there's a few things I wanted to mention before we get on to some discussion. And I think, starting at the beginning, healthcare has a massive carbon footprint. As Forbes mentioned, if you took healthcare as a country, it would be the 5th biggest country in the world in terms of carbon footprint. And in case you're thinking that, listen, I was born here in Toronto, and I think Canada's awesome, and I think Canadians are awesome, and we're all awesome, but we're actually second worst in the world in terms of our carbon footprint per capita in healthcare. So when you take that and you combine it with the very clear message that comes to us from multiple international health organizations, which says that the biggest threat to the health of humanity is climate change. So we have a massive carbon footprint. We know what the #1 kind of threat to the health of humanity is. And all the work we do is really important. I love colorectal surgery, but I can tell you colorectal cancer, even when I check ChatGPT, is not in a top 10 list of what is affecting the world. So we have that. And then I think one thing that, Forbes talked about is our agency. And so one of the things that's been kind of, I guess, interesting with the director of planetary health role is it gets me to tables I otherwise would not be at. And so I get to talk to CEOs and department heads, division heads, leadership. And my message is pretty simple to them. It's, if we know climate change is the #1 threat to the health of humanity, and we know that we have a massive carbon footprint, and we know that there are things that we can do to mitigate these and adapt to what's going on, then if the vision of those leaders does not include planetary health, then I consider that vision irrelevant. And so you can see I lack what Forbes has in terms of finesse and being articulate. That's much more blunt. But then I guess I would be letting everyone else off pretty easily. And one paper that really I like reading, the Harvard Business Review. They have some really interesting articles on healthcare. One of them caught my eye back in, I think it was 2013. And it looked at the NHS. Again, a public system just like ours. And what they found in that paper was that in terms of change, the greatest change was driven by people who didn't have titles. And so all of us, all healthcare professionals, whether you're a nurse, whether you're a pharmacist, whether you're an anesthetist or a surgeon, everything we do, as soon as we walk out of this auditorium and into that operating room, has a carbon footprint. Every action that we have, every blood work, that's drawn, as was mentioned, the desfluorine that's used that has 2,500 times the global warming capacity of carbon dioxide, the disposable trocars we decide to use, the disposable gowns. We all have to start owning that. I don't think it's really cool anymore to leave that up to leaders. I mean, I think leaders should be a part of it, but I think all of us need to be a part of it. And I'll give you a quick example. Forbes mentioned disposable versus reusable gowns. We've been trying to change that in Ottawa. There's a fourth-year medical student who's doing a leadership elective with me, and I was mention this to her. I think she's going to be the reason why we're able to put together this case for changing from disposable to reusable gowns, and not only in the operating room, but the gowns that we're going to use in endoscopy, the gowns, the isolation gowns. And I can assure you, she has no title. And so, again, I think I'm going to use this quote at the end of my lecture. I'm coming back on March 3rd. But I love the quote by Marshall McLuhan, who's a Canadian, modern Canadian philosopher. And he says, on Spaceship Earth, there are no passengers. We are all crew. And I think now, more than ever, that philosophy is needed. And so I want to leave some time for questions instead of you listening to me ramble on up here, and Forbes can't say anything back. And but I think, as you reflect on stuff, and there may be some questions in the chat, what do you do? It's Friday. How do you make things happen on Monday? And Forbes mentioned Ali Abbas, who's done some great work. And I know he has, I think, some title now at St. Joe's, but I don't think it started that way. So Ali, are you on the call? Did you join? If you did, could you unmute yourself? Oh, good, you're here. Perfect. So I don't know, do you mind sharing your story just in terms of, frontline guy and what you've kind of done? You can't talk. Okay, good.
If you give me a minute, I can promote him to a panelist.
Okay, perfect. You're going to get promoted here very quickly, Ali.
I could share his story too, but I will probably better off letting Ali do it.
There we go. Look, Ali, you've made it. I see you on.
I should have waited a bit longer and let Nam go.
All right, I'm gonna hand it over to you for a second so you can tell your story. It'd be great.
Thanks, guys. Just want to thank Dr. Orser and Dr. Swallow and Lee and Ward for organizing this. Thanks, Husein, for being here, and thanks to Forbes far away. He's been my mentor for over 10 years. In fact, as I started into this sphere, being in the OR many years ago and seeing how I could not recycle at work while I recycled at home. And as he said, work matters more than home in this particular context. If you can have an impact here, my carbon footprint would be way lower. I could walk to work, eat vegan, but using desflurane, my carbon impact outweighs my neighbor who has a Hummer and drives 100 kilometers a day for his commute. So it really puts things into perspective. And I found him on Google many years ago when I was trying to see if I could recycle IV bags. And I was like, I wonder if anybody else has done it. And lo and behold, he had, and he's done it well. It's been a very interesting journey. And as the pandemic has come in and we have seen the tremendous amount of waste. Yes, we've seen PPE waste, but we've been generating waste for a long, long time. Just think that it's just part and parcel of business and it can keep on going, but it can't And so, as he said, we have individual agency. We have to take our passion and approach our leaders to really set a vision. We need to have one of the most important things I suggest to anybody who wants to start within their hospital is, yes, that passion's great, and you may be able to drive a few projects just on the basis of that within your own sphere, but to really scale it and embed it into the culture of your institution, you need to have senior leadership buy-in and strategic goal, and you need to start a green committee, whether it's institution-based or even within the OR. And then you can really start to get things going and get representation of, from nursing, from allied health staff, from surgeons, anesthesiologists, infection control, et cetera. And we've had a committee, for example, at our institution centrally, but just recently we got our OR Green Committee set up because we're a very unique environment. And to have a really good, strong impact and a meaningful impact and quickly at a pace that you'd like, you have to have these groups set up and identify a few initiatives and then run with them and follow up and audit and just keep educating and so on and so forth. So yeah, there's a lot of good work going on, but at the same time we see within the GTA where we are, change is hard. People don't want to change. We're embedded in our practices, but leaders within departments have to really step up. The oath we took is to do no harm, not just to our patients, but to our planet, to our communities. And you can't live that dual life. You really have to step up. And getting rid of desflurane. NHS is getting rid of it. Europe is going to get rid of it in 2026, I believe. The European Union. There's colleagues working to see if we can get rid of it here in Canada, but as departments, we can do that now. Yeah.
Great. Thanks for those comments, Ali. And I think, this, when you started out and you said, you reached out to Forbes. I mean, I think that is an option that's there for all of us. So not necessarily all of us have to reach out to Forbes, but, I think there's actually a lot of work going on in Toronto already. Yeah. And I think, finding now people like, there's Ali, but there's like Sarah's doing stuff, last night at dinner, I'm just going to visualize that table and go around in my head here. It was like Laura, who's a thoracic surgeon. There's Mel, the HPB surgeon, Nam, Elaine, who's an anesthetist at Sick Kids. Sabrar showed up, which was great. It's always good to see him. And then Sarah, and then obviously Dr. Swallow's leading the way here. So, I think, and Ali was there too. I think all those people are doing things. So I mean, we can all do things around, like yesterday, our dinner was at Planta because, Dr. Swallow kind of very astutely if we're talking about planetary health, well, maybe we can have dinner there instead of going to Ruth Chris, like the Anesthesiology Examination Board did for the Royal College. So, and I know, listen, hey, every once in a while is great, but I think we really need to start thinking about that, the way we hold events. There are so many opportunities. So, Nam, I don't know if there's questions in the chat. I don't know if there's stuff that you want to mention. I know we're co-moderating this, so I don't want to take all of your time.
Sure. So there's a couple of questions that came from the chat. So one's in the chat, the other one's in the Q&A. So the first one in the chat is from Dr. Faclier. He's an anesthesiologist, and his question is about any specific information regarding the percentage of recycling of certain items like plastic and paper in the hospitals in and around Toronto. And so I am personally not aware of any specific data. There is a green scorecard that was developed by a group called the Center for Sustainable Health Systems. That's in Toronto. And that's a group that's led by a Dr. Fiona Miller. She is not a clinician or a physician, but she is also part of this sphere now. And that green scorecard has an item about waste management, and hospitals are ranked green, yellow, and red. half the hospitals that are ranked are scored are green, the other half are red. And so that's just an overall score. Now, in terms of the actual specific, what's recycled or not, I'm not sure if there's much data on that at the moment, Dr. Faclier. There's also a question from Dr. Failings. He's a surgeon in, I can't remember which hospital now. Last time I remember it was Toronto Western, but Dr. Failings' question is about the carbon footprint of healthcare sector and how it's impacted by green electricity, including nuclear. So that's a great question that I guess is from Dr. McGain's presentation in terms of sources of energy. And Husein actually talked about this very topic last night, and we looked into the data, and Ontario specifically, in terms of the energy generation, as of last year, 58% of it is nuclear, 24% is hydroelectric, 8.5% is gas, and the other 8.5% is wind. So the majority, over 90% of our energy in Ontario is produced from some clean sources. So it's, it puts us at an advantage in terms of where we are in terms of our carbon footprint. And, in terms of Dr. McGain's lecture, it does make sense to use more reusables because our energy input to produce those is much less.
Okay, no, that's great. Thanks for commenting on that. I know Ali has a quick comment, and then there's a question person here. So Ali, maybe I'll let you comment, and then we'll take a question from the floor here at Mount Sinai.
Sure. If I understood Dr. Facklier's question correctly, so in terms of plastics, in Toronto, at least, most waste vendors, recycling haulers will take rigid plastics. They don't take soft plastics anymore, wrappers and that. They're not recyclable since China stopped importing our plastics in 2018. So rigid plastics, paper, cardboard, etc., and glass. Large glass vials, they're recyclable if you take the top off. How much gets recycled? The CBC had an article a number of years ago. They said perhaps 9% of our plastics get recycled there. I don't know that there's been any very recent study or data, but at the same time, we cannot not do it, even though it's a low yield item. There are much higher yield initiatives that one can undertake at the hospital, like we were talking about yesterday, the Stryker single-use medical device reprocessing. That is high yield. PVC recycling, if you can do it, is high yield because we don't pay for that stuff to be hauled away. The recycler takes it at their own cost. And so it's in their interest to make sure that they're going to use that raw material that they're getting and making into hoses and that. So that's high yield. I think there was a question in there saying, if you're going to do PVC recycling, I can answer that too, whether there can be medication added. Of course, you want empty IV bags. Most of the medications we use, say in the OR, they may have, antibiotic mini bag that went through with some medication. As long as it's empty, and that is some best practice teaching, it can be considered an empty container. And it can then be disposed of as garbage or recycling if that stream is available, even though it may have a residual drop. And if there's a syringe with, you've emptied it and it's got a residual drop of medication, it can be treated as general waste. It doesn't have to go to a pharmaceutical bin.
Okay, awesome. No, thank you for that, Ali. And then we have a question here. It's Dr. Platt.
I'm not sure if people realize the University of Toronto's effort to become carbon positive by 2030. We're the second best university globally. And I think that's something we need to think about. We talked about recycling at home, which many of us have done for years. We're now talking about everybody's conscious effort at work, which I think is an amazing effort. I want to thank everybody for highlighting this. And probably getting us tangibles of how we can all get there every day. We think about safety checklists for patients, but I think we're now, this initial lecture is a commitment for a lot of us to be environmental stewards. So I think it's important, like we've talked about, perhaps the next iteration to hear from our universities with respect to their plans. Because the Federal Minister of the Environment was here 2 weeks ago, right next to the Stewart Building, making announcements about their commitment for campus to go completely green That's that grid work, the whole team circles ripped up, driving everybody crazy. Because really the energy sources are changing. And I'm not an expert, I'm very true expert. And the pandemic's been great because I've heard my husband on one of these conference calls where he'll bring up the plans for buildings like that. It's not just our homes or the OR, it's these buildings, it's how we function. And it's all really changing. So I just want to thank you for coming. I've heard about your work in the past, and I think this is a great topic for all of us to think about as we try to deal with global warming.
Awesome. No, thanks so much for that that comment. That's awesome. And you're right. You know, like U of T is a real kind of leader in this area, and I think just by virtue, I have to say it, even though I'm from Ottawa, just the virtue of being U of T, you guys have a lot of sway nationally.
Husein, I think you know, there's more questions in the online chat, and looking at the time, you know, it's already we have 3 minutes left, and so I don't know about you, but you
sorry,
know,
man, sorry, I can't hear anything.
That's okay. Can you hear me now?
It's the overhead page.
No problem. So
it's good to see that some things are consistent between all hospitals. So yeah, I love it when this happens in Ottawa too. Sorry, Nam. I know we have 3 minutes left, but yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so as I said, we have 3 minutes left, and you know, there's a few more questions which we'll get to, but I just quickly wanted to say that, you know, there's some comments in there about, you know, how to get involved and how to, you know, maybe do more in this realm. And my message would just be, you know, the next step would be to think about how to join forces, right? And there's work being done everywhere, locally, regionally, nationally, but we need a more coordinated effort. And, you know, whether that's through the university model, the department model, or the hospital side, you know, that I think it means that we need to think about how to take this forward and, you know, joint efforts, because we're all doing a lot of the same work, and, you know, how to really synergize the efforts.
Okay, we could probably go on for another half hour. I can see a lot of interest. Those of you who have made comments or questions in the chat, we do have it recorded, and Husein and Nam will make every effort to reach out to you individually and address what you have said. I do want to thank everyone, thank all of you for being here today. It's quite a big in-person turnout, so thank you for coming out. I want to thank Nam and Sarah for helping organize, Bev for sponsoring along with the Department of Surgery. And I want to thank Sylvia and Sahar and Chriselle for organizing everything. I think it went relatively smoothly compared to the disaster I was imagining. And finally, Husein, if you like what you saw today, Husein is staying on for a town hall in the grand room of the Surgical Skills Center from 9 to 11 this morning. And then he will be back for a return engagement Friday, March 3rd as our Palmer lecturer. So thanks so much, Husein. We really enjoyed it. Thank you, everyone. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Jason. Oops.
No problem. I'm going to end the webinar for all.